Let's look at John Rawls's theory of justice. With Rawls, we move from ethics at the individual level to ethics at the societal level. This is called social justice. Rawls's starting position is that we're pretty lucky. That is, you're pretty lucky and I'm pretty lucky, all things considered. I know this because we're in university, we're taking classes using technology that allows us to get online. That involves some luck. So we're luckier than some people. Maybe we're less lucky than some other people. And on top of that, let's face it, we're all out for number one. That is, centrally, I'm more concerned with my well-being than my neighbor's well-being. So Rawls's question is, given that some people are luckier than others, some people are a lot luckier than others, and given that ultimately all of us is out for number one, how are we going to realistically determine principles of society, principles of ethics, principles of justice that everyone would agree to? Rawls is building on Immanuel Kant's notion of justice. Rawls is, ultimately, a deontologist. He's especially concerned with the idea of justice that we saw set out in the formula of universal law. Rawls says, justice is the founding virtue of social institutions. Social institutions are going to be things like competitive markets or private property or the law. For Rawls, justice is a matter of fairness, most centrally. He says that justice is inviolate. The loss of freedom for some people can't be justified on the basis that it gives rise to some greater good shared by others. So, some good like happiness or money that some group might get doesn't compare with a loss of freedom or autonomy that others might lose. This should sound an awful lot like the formula of humanity. The rights, he says, that are secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or calculation of aggregate social interests. We all get those same rights. They're not the sort of thing that can be traded away. Rawls says that an injustice is tolerable only when it's necessary to avoid an even greater injustice. There's no amount of good that can pay for injustice. Okay, that's justice. Let's talk about the social part of social justice. Rawls says, assume that a society is a largely self-sufficient association of persons who recognize certain binding rules of societal conduct and who generally act according to them. In other words, a society is a group of people who are able to survive together and are able to do so because they recognize that there are rules, there are laws, there are standards. These rules are designed to advantage the good of the participants. In other words, it's good for all of us to be a member of society. That's why we agree to the rules. So, society, Rawls says, consists in a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. And that's just to say we're all in this together. We all join a society rather than just going off and living in the woods because we think it's individually good for each of us to be a member of a society. So the problem is that also we're ultimately all out for number one. So it's a cooperative venture for mutual advantage in which everybody in the group is out for number one. So we need a set of principles for the assignments of rights and duties within that society, which in turn determine the appropriate distribution of benefits and burdens of social cooperation. Rawls says that a society is well ordered. It's a good, a just society if it's designed so that, first, everyone accepts and knows that others accept the same principles of justice, the same basic ethical principles, and second, that the basic social institutions like the market, like the law, like the police, like the church, are generally known to satisfy these principles of justice. This should sound an awful lot like the formula of universal law. So Rawls's idea is that a general desire for justice that we all have offsets individual inclinations that each of us has towards self-interested ends. As it happens, the institutions of society favor certain starting positions over others. So, social institutions, things like how the market works, things like how the distribution of jobs and wealth goes, serves to affect our initial chances in life. In America today, it's simply better to be born white than non-white, wealthy than poor, male than non-male. That's just to say, it's going to be easier for you if you're born male than if you're born non-male. It's going to be easier, all things considered, if you were born white than if you're born non-white in America. It's not to say it's going to be easy for anybody, but it's going to be easier. It's a little feather in your cap in American society today if you're born wealthy than if you're born middle class or poor. It might be that any society is going to favor certain starting positions over others, and the ones that are favored in our society are just arbitrary. So it's to these perhaps inevitable inequalities, Rawls says, that the principles of social justice have to be applied, because society is never going to be a perfectly level playing field. Rawls's theory of justice starts with what's called social contract theory. Now, social contract theory has been put forward by a number of different philosophers in a number of different ways. One of the big names was John Locke, who we're going to look at later in the course. Then there's Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I include mostly so I can use my outrageous French accent, and our old buddy Immanuel Kant. Now, like I say, they all frame the theory in slightly different ways, but they all come down to basically the same thing. This is the theory that either explicitly or implicitly, members of a society agree to give up certain freedoms in order to receive social order through rule of law. We agree to live as a society because we think it's good for us to do so. And in order to do that, we have to give up certain things. So we agree to give up the freedom to punch others in the back of the head because you want to feel reasonably secure that other people aren't going to punch you in the back of the head. You agree to give up the freedom to not wear a mask in class during a pandemic because you don't want society to be dragged to its knees by a plague. It would be very bad for you. So you want to do well, so you want society to do well. So you agree to give up certain things that otherwise you might want to keep. The problem, Rawls says, is that in most cases, you've not signed a social contract. You're born into a society. You're not given the option of not signing. You only sign a social contract if you leave your society and join a different one. So Rawls wants to set up a sort of situation that comes as close to voluntary agreement to a social contract as possible. At the heart of this are going to be the principles of justice. The principles of justice are those that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept from an initial position of equality. In other words, they constitute the core of the social contract that you would have signed if you were at an even playing field with everybody else. These principles of justice are going to be the ones that serve to regulate all further agreements in that society. They're going to specify forms of social cooperation, of law, of government, of the market, of industry, and so on. Okay, good. So we're looking for the principles of justice. The principles of justice are at the core of social contract. We want a way to determine something that comes as close to voluntary agreement as possible. So how do we figure out what the principles of justice are? Rawls starts with what he calls the original position. He says the original position is the hypothetical state of equality from which rational persons would determine the principles of justice, which is a pretty dense description. So I like to imagine this. Imagine we wanted to form our own society. And so we all get together in a big board meeting to hash out how that's going to work. we need to figure out what principle or principles our society is going to be built on. Okay, and we're going to be here a long time, so we're going to order in pizza. It's going to be a whole thing. But the trick is, instead of, say, simply packing up and moving to an island to start our society, each of us is going to be born into that society, which is already going to be running according to the principles that we've chosen in our little boardroom meeting. And here in our little boardroom meeting, where we're trying to figure out what the principles of justice for our society will be, we don't know what we're going to be like when we're born in that society. So there's going to be a sort of starting position lottery that we're going to be born into. This is called the veil of ignorance. Rawls says, to ensure that no one in our little boardroom meeting, the original position, is advantaged or disadvantaged by the principles once they're born into that society, the essential features of the hypothetical position include that nobody in the boardroom knows what their class position or social status is going to be in that society. So you don't know if you're going to be male or female or other. You don't know if you're going to be black or white or Asian or Hispanic or native. You don't know if you're going to be fair-haired or dark-haired, light-skinned or dark-skinned. Nobody knows what their natural assets or abilities will be. You don't know if you are going to be healthy or unhealthy. You don't know if you're going to be naturally athletic or kind of clumsy. You don't know if you're going to be very smart or just dumb as a stump. You don't know. Nobody knows their conceptions of good or psychological propensities. In other words, you don't know if you're going to be a virtuous person or you're going to be a vicious person. We don't know what we're going to be like when we're in the boardroom meeting trying to decide how that society should run. But we should assume that all of the parties in the original position, everyone in the boardroom meeting is first rational and second mutually disinterested. So everyone is going to reason through their thinking when they're contributing to this discussion, and everyone is trying to make it as good for themselves as possible, although they don't know what they're going to be like. Okay. Rawls says that one conception of justice, one idea of justice, is more reasonable than another, or justifiable with respect to it, if rational persons in the initial situation, the original position, would choose those principles over the other for the role of justice. Here's what Rawls is thinking. If you go up to an ordinary person on the street today, in South Carolina or wherever you are, and ask them if our society is a just society, the answer that you get is going to depend very much on whether our society has helped that person you're talking to or whether it's hurt them. In other words, if they've done very well, then they're going to say we live in a just society. If life has been hard for them, they're going to probably say that we don't live in a just society. So we really can't trust any answer you get on the street. If you want to find out whether our society is just, we have to ask the people in the original position. And the way that we ask them is we say, is our society being run according to principles that you would have agreed to in the original position? If yes, then our society is just. If no, then our society is not just. Okay, so here in the original position, what is the rational choice that you should make when it comes to figuring out what the principles of justice should be? The veil of ignorance seems to make it impossible to tailor principles specifically to the circumstances of your own case. So you don't know if you're going to be born healthy or with a congenital birth disorder. So you don't want to set up our society so that it only benefits one group or the other. You don't know if you're going to be born healthy or unhealthy, black or white, Asian, Hispanic. You don't know if you're going to be tall or short, left-handed or right-handed. So you're not going to be able to skew things specifically to your advantage. We should also assume that everyone in the original position has an equal vote. They have the same rights for proposing principles, for voting on those principles, and for debating those principles. The good thing is that we already have a generally shared idea of justice. That is, we already generally agree about what justice looks like and what injustice looks like. We already generally agree that religious intolerance is bad, it's unjust. We already generally agree that discrimination on the basis of gender or race or age is unjust. So a theory of justice should largely fit what we already agree upon, although this might take some pruning, some revision, and it should help us to answer the difficult questions, like how do we distribute wealth in this society, or labor, or authority? Now this should sound, at this point, an awful lot like how I described normative ethics. I said that a theory of normative ethics has two jobs. First, it should explain the easy cases, the things we already agree about. And second, it should tell us what to do in the hard cases, those cases where we don't agree, or that we think is going to take some detailed work. Principles of justice, Rawls says, are going to be justified because they're the principles that would be agreed upon in an initial situation of equality, the original position. Okay, so we have our boardroom. We toss out some ideas, we drill down, we question those ideas, we propose alternative ideas. Rawls says through this process, he thinks we would reach reflective equilibrium. That's to say that through this back and forth of group deliberation, I assume that eventually we shall find a description of the initial situation that both expresses reasonable conditions and yields principles which match our considered judgments duly pruned and adjusted. That's just to say that eventually he thinks we will agree on the basic principles that our society should start with, that our institutions should be built according to. But this is going to take some work. It's going to take some work because each of us is very invested in the outcome of this meeting. So we're going to be there a while. We don't want to get out as fast as possible. We only want to finish the meeting once we're absolutely sure that we've got the right principles. Because if we choose badly, we're stuck with these principles and we're going to be screwed. So we want to make really sure that we understand the principles that are being put forward, that they're not going to run us into problems down the line, and that we have an alternative if we run into problems there. Okay, so all that's speaking pretty abstractly. So what sort of principles might we be considering? Well, somebody might suggest something like social utilitarianism. We already understand utilitarianism. Social utilitarianism is just the same principle now applied to structuring a society. So this is the view that a society is just, it's good, it's right, when its major institutions are arranged so as to provide the greatest aggregate satisfaction measured over all of its members. In other words, the idea behind social utilitarianism is that a good society is one that's structured to produce the most happiness in total. It might not be the most happiness for each person, but it's the most happiness for the society as a whole. So on this view, it doesn't really matter how our goods are distributed, provided that it increases the aggregate, the total satisfaction of our society. And that sounds nice. Each of us wants happiness, so why wouldn't we want to be members of a society that works to maximize its happiness? The problem, Rawls says, is that in principle, on this view, the violation of liberty for some can be made not only right, but obligatory because it provides a greater good for others. So consider this. Let's say that we take a small portion of our society, say just the people with green eyes, or just the left-handed people, or just the people with red hair, 10% of our population, and we get them to do all the work, all the heavy lifting, all the labor, all the driving, all the grocery shopping, all the laundry, all the cooking, all the crap work that we don't want to do. That sounds nice. Moreover, let's say that we're not going to pay them. We're just going to make them do it. Okay, well, that starts to sound an awful lot like slavery, and that's exactly what it is. But here's the problem. If making 10% of our population do all the work would make the rest of us happier, even if it makes that 10% of the population very unhappy, there's a possibility that their unhappiness simply won't outweigh the happiness had by the 90% majority. So according to utilitarianism, not only can we do this, we have to, because it's going to make for more happiness than not enslaving some portion of our population. That's a problem. And it's a problem if you're in the original position, because you don't know if you're going to be left-handed or green-eyed or right-handed or brown-eyed or brown-haired or red-haired or what. So if you vote for a principle of social utilitarianism, not knowing what you're going to be like in that society because you're behind the veil of ignorance, then you risk voting yourself into slavery. And nobody wants that. So we're going to have to consider lots of principles. But eventually, Rawls says he thinks we'll get there, because there are two principles that are really going to stand out. First, Rawls says, each person in our society should have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberties compatible with a similar liberty for others. In other words, everyone in our society should get the same basic fundamental rights. Like what? Well, like political liberty, freedom of vote, or freedom of speech, freedom of thought, the right to hold private property, freedom against arbitrary arrest and seizure. Things that should start to sound like a familiar list, should start to sound like the Bill of Rights. That's because when you're in the original position and you're thinking of how things might go for you in the birth lottery in our society, when you don't know what you're going to be like, you're going to want the same rights no matter what. If you are born healthy and wealthy, you're going to want those rights. If you are born poor and disenfranchised, unhealthy, with a congenital birth disorder, you're going to want the same rights. If you are black or white or Asian or Hispanic, whether you're tall or short or fat or skinny, you want those same basic rights. So, in the original position, we're going to all agree that we should all get the same basic rights, no matter what. Okay, second. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage and attached to positions and offices open to all. That's a mouthful, but we're talking about goods here. And goods can be distributed equally or unequally. Okay, so we can either have everybody have the same amount of money, for instance, or have different amounts of money. Some people have more, some people have less. But we could also talk about things like power, authority. Some people have lots, some people have little. How are we going to organize our government? How are we going to organize business? These are the sorts of things we're talking about here. There are ways to organize them equally, and there are ways to organize them unequally. So we're comparing systems. So for a little toy example, something simple, let's talk about taxes. That's funny because taxes aren't simple. Taxes are ridiculously, stupidly complicated. My brother's an accountant. He's the sort of person you hire to do your taxes because taxes are ridiculously, stupidly complicated, and they change every year just to make it worse. With taxes here in America, we start with your tax bracket. That depends on how much money you made from your various sources of income. The idea is the more money you make, the higher percentage of that money you pay in taxes. If you make a lot of money, you pay a high percentage in taxes. If you make very little money, you probably pay nothing in taxes. Okay, that is a social inequality. The fact that different people pay different percentages of their income as taxes is simply unequal. Okay, so Rawls's idea for the second principle of justice is that sort of social inequality has to be justified. We need a good reason to distribute goods unequally. So every time there is a federal election, there's some talk of taxes and how to make them easier, how to make them better. Back in 2012, we had Herman Cain's 999 tax system. Cain's idea was this, that every company would pay a flat 9% corporate tax, that each of us would pay a 9% income tax, and that when you buy something, you pay a 9% sales tax. Everyone pays exactly the same taxes. So Cain is selling this as a social equality. It's even, it's the same for everybody, and it's easier. So that's nice too. Okay. But we didn't go for that. We didn't go for Herman Cain. So if we want to have the tax system we do or something like it, then we have to justify having an unequal tax bracket. Rawls says the distribution of wealth and income doesn't have to be equal, but it does have to be to everyone's advantage. So if you're going to have something unequal, you need a reason for it. In the case of taxes, we need to make the case that it's better that those who make the least pay the least in terms of taxes, and that those who make the most pay the most. So we need an argument. And the basic idea here would be that, well, those who are on the bottom rung of income simply can't afford to pay income tax. If they had to pay income tax, then it means they would have to choose between not paying their rent, not affording food, or not affording medicine. And anytime you leave one of those out, you're not going to be able to work. And it's to everyone's advantage that these people are working. These are the people who are farming our food. They're the ones who are selling us our groceries. They're the ones who are collecting our garbage and taking it away. If those people can't work because they have to pay more in income tax, then that means that it's worse for everybody. It's worse for everybody if those people have to pay more in taxes. If those people have to pay as much in taxes as we do. It's particularly bad for them because they don't get to work, or they don't get to have shelter or food or medical care. So, our current system, in which those who make more pay more and those who make the least pay the least, is, we can argue, to everyone's advantage. Because it's to our advantage to have people who are in, well, the service industry. Now, in the original position, the reason you'd vote for such an inequality is because you don't know where you're going to end up in the birth lottery. Are you going to be lucky and have parents who have enough money to send you to a prestigious school so you can get a great job so you don't have to work at a grocery store or in a farmer's field or collecting other people's trash? Or are you going to be on the low end? In the original position, when you're voting for a principle of justice that our society is going to be founded on, you're going to want things to go as good as possible for you, no matter what your starting position is. So you might be willing to accept a social inequality if it makes things better for you, no matter what. That's what the second principle of justice is about. The basic structure of society distributes certain primary goods, powers, opportunities, rights, and liberties that are things that any rational person is going to want. From an initial starting condition where goods are evenly distributed, if certain inequalities would make every individual better off than that starting condition, than pure equality, then that's okay. This is in accord with the original idea. So injustice, then, amounts to inequalities that are not to the benefit of all. Inequalities, Rawls says, are permissible when they maximize or at least contribute to the long-term expectations of the least fortunate group in society. So on the sort of setup that we've conceived here in the original position, it isn't, at least it shouldn't be possible for anybody in the original position to win special advantage for himself. So Rawls says this nicely follows a principle of economics that's going to justify why we're going to do things this way. The principle is called maximin. Maximin is a method for what's called choice under uncertainty, for trying to make a decision about how to move forward when you don't have all the details. According to maximin, we rank our alternatives, our possible actions, according to the worst possible outcome for each of those, and then we pick the best of the worst. So maximin doesn't always apply. In order for maximin to be the right way to go, the choice being considered should be one that doesn't securely admit of knowledge of likelihoods of outcomes. In other words, we really don't know how likely the outcomes are. Second, the person doing the choosing cares little for what he or she might gain above the minimum stipend that they can be sure of by following that maximin rule. In other words, anything over and above the minimum is just gravy. Finally, the situation involves grave risks, that an alternative way of going might provide an outcome that's extremely undesirable. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the original position. So let's start with an analogy. Let's say you have $200 in your pocket, which is, as it happens, exactly what you need to pay for your basic necessities, at least until your next paycheck. So this will get you by. It'll pay for your rent, it'll pay for your utilities, it'll pay for your groceries, and you're good. But you're presented with an opportunity to invest this money. So let's say you have three options here for investment. Things might go well under either option, or things might go badly. Let's say with option A, you invest your $200, and if things go well, you get another $100. You're up to $300. That's pretty good. But if things go poorly, you're going to lose it all. You'll be down to bupkis. With option B, if things go really well, you're up $50. That's $250. You get a spare $50. That's still pretty good. If things go badly, you're going to lose $75, which means you're going to have to now choose between rent and food and paying your utilities. Option C is the safe move. You don't invest that money. So if things go well, you don't make any money, and if things go poorly, you don't lose any money. Okay, well, the maximin principle says in this case, you should rank things according to when things go poorly, and then you should pick the best option for these, which means picking option C. Don't invest the money. You can't afford to lose any of it, and anything you get over and above what you already have is just gravy. Well, Rawls is thinking the same thing for the original position. We don't know how things will go because we don't know what our starting position in the lottery will be. If we set things up so we get at least the basics that everyone gets, then things are okay. At least okay. Anything else would be nice, but it's gravy. But if we choose badly, and we choose something like social utilitarianism, and if things go badly, they go really badly, because you might have just voted yourself into slavery.